The summer of 1941 had begun with the same promises that every summer seemed to bring to the Soviet countryside. Fields shimmered beneath a warm sun, stretching endlessly across the steppe, and villages hummed with the familiar rhythm of farm work. Children ran barefoot through the dirt lanes, chasing each other with sticks, while older women leaned on wooden fences, chatting in low voices as the younger ones carried buckets from the wells. Life was far from easy in these villages, but there was a sense of routine, of a steady pattern that people could rely on. The Great Patriotic War, as it would soon be called, was not yet part of daily speech. Newspapers carried slogans about vigilance and industry, about the greatness of the Soviet future, but the shadow of Hitler's Germany seemed far away, somewhere beyond the western border, separated by forests, rivers, and distance. Welcome to The Boring Historian. Tonight's story is life in the Soviet Union during Hitler's invasion. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more calming history. Tell me in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there. Now, let's drift into the past, into the quiet endurance of the Soviet people during one of history's darkest chapters. Most villagers in the Soviet Union had no reason to believe that the summer would bring anything other than harvest work. The government often spoke in lofty tones about the strength of the Red Army, the might of Soviet industry, and the triumph of socialism. There were worries, of course there always were, but those belonged to whispered conversations after dark, not to the bright mornings filled with the smell of bread baking in clay ovens and the low hum of bees circling wildflowers. The war in Europe seemed distant, like a storm seen on the horizon but never reaching the village itself. And then, one morning in June, the sound of engines shattered the quiet. At first, it was a strange sound, not quite recognizable to those who had never heard an aircraft up close. The villagers squinted upward, hands raised to their brows, shielding their eyes from the glare of the sun. Black dots appeared in the blue sky, growing larger, their hum swelling into a roar. For a heartbeat, there was confusion. Were these Soviet planes moving to some exercise, perhaps a military display? But the speed, the sheer number, and the sudden, shrieking whistles that followed quickly erased all doubt. Bombs began to fall. The ground shook as though the earth itself had snapped awake from a long sleep. Houses splintered, barns burst into flames, and fields that had been so carefully tended erupted in fountains of dirt and fire. Cattle screamed, people scattered, and the calm of Soviet summer was replaced by chaos. Smoke rose in thick, oily columns, blackening the sky that had only moments ago promised a season of warmth and growth. The sky had darkened in an instant, and with it the lives of millions. In the towns and cities, the shock was no less severe. On the morning of June 22, 1941, radio broadcasts interrupted their usual programs with terse, hurried announcements. People stopped in their tracks, ears straining toward the crackling voices that spoke of an invasion, of German forces crossing the border in a massive assault known as Operation Barbarossa. Crowds gathered at loudspeakers in factories and public squares, their faces pale, their expressions frozen in disbelief. Hitler's war had come not as a distant echo, but as a thunderclap right at their doors. The first reaction was often silence that carried more weight than shouts or panic ever could. Families sat around their kitchen tables in stunned stillness, listening to the faint ticking of the clock as though the sound itself might confirm the reality of the news. Children, sensing the fear in their parents' faces, clung closer, their laughter subdued, their questions left unanswered. Then, slowly, life shifted into motion. Men of fighting age began preparing to leave, gathering whatever belongings they could before reporting to local recruitment stations. Women packed small bundles for them, pressing bits of food into their hands, though no one knew how far they would go or how long they would be gone. Some cried quietly, dabbing at their eyes with kerchiefs. Others held their emotions tightly inside, determined to remain strong for those departing. For many, the invasion felt unreal, like a nightmare from which they might still wake. Yet every passing day brought new evidence. Columns of smoke in the distance, refugees trudging eastward with carts piled high, rumors of towns already swallowed by the advancing German army, stories of bombings, of soldiers marching through villages, of neighbors lost overnight began to circulate, filling the air with dread that settled into every home, every factory, every field. The Soviet summer had turned suddenly into a season of fear and upheaval. The daily rhythm that had defined so much of life, the milking of cows at dawn, the sowing of crops, the evenings spent repairing tools, was now replaced by a constant sense of uncertainty. People listened for distant thunder, not of storms but of artillery. They scanned the skies, not for clouds, but for the dark silhouettes of planes. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of danger. Yet, in the midst of shock, ordinary people still tried to cling to the familiar. Women kneaded bread with trembling hands, determined to keep families fed. Children, though hushed, still played with sticks and stones, their games now reimagined as battles they scarcely understood. Old men sat on benches outside their homes, staring into the distance, smoking pipes that seemed to burn faster in their trembling hands. Life did not stop, even as the world seemed to fall apart. Tip merely changed, bending under the weight of fear. That first summer of invasion was a season of endings and beginnings. It marked the end of innocence for millions of Soviet families, the end of peace, the end of familiar patterns that had stretched across generations. But it also marked the beginning of a long struggle, a new way of living shaped not by choice but by necessity. The morning after the first bombs fell, the village seemed both unchanged and unrecognizable. The wooden cottages still stood in their crooked rows along the dusty lane. Chickens still wandered freely, scratching at the earth. A dog barked at nothing in particular, as it had every morning for years. Yet something invisible had shifted, something so heavy that even the children felt it. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of uncertainty. No one really knew what had happened beyond the fields and forests. Rumors spread faster than the smoke that still lingered on the horizon. One man claimed to have heard from a cousin in a nearby town that the Germans had already reached Minsk. Another insisted he had seen soldiers moving east along the road, muttering that the Red Army was already retreating. An old woman swore she had counted dozens of planes flying overhead in the night, their engines humming like a swarm of angry bees. Every tale was told in whispers, in the spaces between chores, and no one dared to say too much in front of the children. The village had no radio of its own, only the battered loudspeaker in the administrative hut, which crackled into life from time to time with official announcements. The voice it carried was always calm, always authoritative, urging citizens to remain steadfast, to support the Red Army, to trust in the strength of the Soviet Union. But the villagers knew the gaps between the broadcasts spoke louder than the words themselves. Silence, they understood, was never a good sign. Each evening, people gathered in small knots by the well or outside the barn, trading stories and rumors like precious coins. Who had seen soldiers on the Western Road? Who had a brother or son already called to fight? Whose cousin had fled with the factory workers on the last train out? These fragments of news were stitched together into a patchwork of fear and hope, though no one could be sure which parts were true. The uncertainty gnawed at them more sharply than hunger or exhaustion ever could. And then came the soldiers. It was late afternoon when the sound of boots on the road reached the village, faint at first, then unmistakable. The children ran ahead to see, eyes wide with both curiosity and dread. Soon, the villagers gathered along the roadside as a column of Red Army troops passed through. Their uniforms were dusty, their faces drawn with fatigue, and their rifles slung wearily across their shoulders. Some were no older than the boys who usually herded cows through the meadows. Others looked as though they had carried the weight of many winters. The villagers offered what little they had: jars of water, a crust of bread, a few apples from a nearby orchard. The soldiers accepted with gratitude, though often in silence, their eyes fixed on the road ahead. When they did speak, it was only to reassure the villagers that everything was under control, that the Germans would be stopped, that the Soviet Union would never fall. But their faces betrayed the truth. They were frightened, too. As the column moved on, the village seemed emptier than before, as if the soldiers had taken with them not just food and water, but also the last fragments of certainty. That night, the villagers huddled inside their homes, the glow of small lamps flickering against walls that suddenly felt too thin to protect them. Mothers soothed their children with lullabies, but even the songs carried an edge of unease. Old men sat awake by the stove, smoking in silence, staring at the cracks in the floor as though answers might emerge from the wood grain. The following days blurred into one another. Some mornings brought new columns of troops, marching quickly through without stopping, their voices low, their footsteps heavy. Other days brought refugees' families with carts piled high, women leading children by the hand, their faces hollow with exhaustion. They carried their stories with them, of villages bombed, of homes abandoned, of nights spent in the open fields with only the stars for shelter. Each tale spread quickly, leaving behind a trail of dread that hung over the village like smoke. The rhythm of life was broken, yet people still clung to their routines as best they could. Fields had to be tended, animals had to be fed, bread had to be baked. But every task was accompanied by glances toward the western horizon, as if danger itself might appear at any moment. The sound of distant thunder no longer meant storms, it meant artillery. The faint hum of engines overhead meant airplanes, not clouds. What the villagers longed for most was news, real news, something solid they could hold on to. But all they had were fragments, a rumor from a soldier, a story from a refugee, a few carefully chosen words from the loudspeaker. The rest was silence, and silence, in those days, felt as heavy as iron. And so, they waited. They waited in doorways, in fields, at the edge of the well. They waited for news of sons and brothers sent to fight, for the return of soldiers who had marched away down the dusty road, for some word that the storm had passed and that life might return to its familiar rhythms. But the days grew longer, the rumors darker, and the horizon more threatening with each passing hour. The village that had once measured time in harvests and seasons now measured it in uncertainty, waiting for the next fragment of news to arrive, whether carried by soldier, refugee, or rumor whispered at dusk. The waiting itself became a kind of work, a daily burden carried silently by every man, woman, and child. And in that waiting, they began to understand that the invasion was not just a matter of armies and battles. It was something that had seeped into the very marrow of daily life, reshaping every thought, every breath, every hope for tomorrow. The first weeks of the invasion left little time for reflection. What had begun with shock and disbelief soon turned into hurried decisions, often made in silence, sometimes without choice. By midsummer of 1941, the word spreading through villages, towns, and cities was the same: evacuation. Families were told to leave behind their homes, their animals, their tools, and even their most cherished possessions. The German advance was fast, relentless, and the Soviet Union's survival now depended on something as simple and as impossible as moving east. For some, the decision was forced. Officials arrived with lists, reading aloud the names of those who were to be relocated. Trains were being assembled, carts requisitioned, and entire factories dismantled piece by piece to be reassembled beyond the reach of the Germans. Workers, engineers, teachers, and their families were told they must go at once. Their homes could wait, their belongings could be sacrificed, but their labor, their knowledge, their hands were needed in the East. The roads became clogged with humanity. Families trudged forward with whatever they could carry: blankets rolled tightly, sacks of flour slung across shoulders, children balanced on carts pulled by weary horses. Some pushed bicycles laden with bundles, others guided cows or goats, unwilling to abandon the animals that had been their livelihood. The sound of footsteps mixed with the creak of wooden wheels, the lowing of cattle, and the muffled cries of children too tired to walk. Trains offered another kind of journey, though not one of comfort. Freight wagons hastily cleared were packed with families, workers, machinery, and livestock alike. The smell of iron and dust filled the air, mingling with the sweat of too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Mothers held their children tightly, whispering reassurances they themselves barely believed. The elderly leaned against walls of rough wood, their faces etched with lines that deepened as the train rattled forward. At every station, new groups tried to board, pushing forward with desperation, clutching tickets or simply begging for a place inside. The evacuation of factories was perhaps the most extraordinary sight. Massive machines, towering presses, lathes, and furnaces were dismantled, numbered, and loaded onto flatbed rail. Workers followed alongside their equipment, as though tethered to the machines that defined their lives. They carried not only their tools but also a sense of duty, that the war would not be won without steel, without tanks, without rifles, and that their work, though far from the front, was as important as any soldier's rifle. For the families leaving their homes, the journey east felt endless. Days blurred into nights, the landscape shifting slowly from familiar fields to rolling forests, then to open steppe. Sleep came only in snatches, interrupted by the lurching of carts or the screech of train wheels on iron tracks. Hunger was a constant companion, bread rationed carefully, water shared sparingly. Some children asked when they would return home, their voices soft and uncertain. Others simply stared silently at the horizon, too young to understand, yet too old not to feel the weight of fear. There were moments of kindness along the way. Villagers in towns not yet touched by the invasion offered what food they could spare, potatoes, a jar of milk, sometimes even a corner of a barn to sleep in. Strangers shared blankets with one another, children shared crusts of bread, and songs were sung quietly in the night to keep spirits alive. Yet beneath every act of generosity was the awareness that this was only the beginning of a long ordeal, and that the shadow of the German advance was stretching further east each day. For those on the trains, the world outside became a blur. Windows were few, and when they did appear, they revealed endless miles of countryside slipping past, villages that looked much like the ones they had left behind. Each station stop was filled with the same scenes: soldiers marching, civilians waiting, announcements echoing through tinny loudspeakers. The passengers inside rarely knew where they were or how far they had come. The only certainty was movement, the relentless march away from the West, away from home. In cities, the evacuation left its own mark. Streets once filled with the sounds of trams and workers' footsteps grew eerily quiet. The factories, stripped bare of their machines, stood like hollow shells, their walls echoing with the absence of noise. Apartments emptied in haste, leaving behind furniture, books, and photographs that would never again be claimed. The city itself seemed to exhale, releasing its people in a long sigh as they departed for destinations unknown. For those who stayed behind, the emptiness was a kind of haunting. They watched neighbors depart with carts and wagons, waving weakly from the roadside, unsure whether they would ever meet again. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise of departure, for it signaled not peace but abandonment, a reminder that the village or town was now exposed, vulnerable, and waiting for the storm to arrive. The long march east was not only a physical journey but also a journey of transformation. Families who had lived in the same place for generations found themselves adrift, without roots, without certainty. Workers who had once known the rhythm of factory shifts now measured time by the turns of a wheel or the distance between train stations. Children who had played in familiar fields now learned the contours of strangers' roads, the shapes of new horizons. It was a journey that seemed to have no end, yet for the Soviet Union, it was also a journey of survival. The movement east was not simply an escape, it was a strategy, a way of ensuring that when the Germans pressed deeper into Soviet lands, the heart of the nation, its people, its industry, its will would still endure. And so the march continued, day after day, night after night, a steady migration of a people determined to outlast the storm. Hunger arrived slowly, like a shadow creeping across the land. At first, people did not speak of it directly. They told themselves it was temporary, a disruption that would soon pass, like a storm that lashes the fields and then moves on. But as weeks turned into months, and as the Germans pushed deeper into Soviet territory, the disruption became a constant companion. For many, food was no longer something taken for granted. It became the center of every thought, every plan, every quiet conversation in the night. The first sign was the bread lines. Where once people had walked into a shop and purchased what they needed with coins or rubles, now they stood in long, silent queues stretching around corners. Each person carried a ration card, a small slip of paper that decided whether a family ate or went without. The cards became more precious than money itself, guarded carefully in pockets and drawers, folded and refolded until the edges softened with wear. Standing in line became a daily ritual. People rose before dawn, sometimes hours before the bakery opened, hoping that by being early they might have a better chance of receiving their ration. They waited in the chill of morning, wrapped in coats that smelled of smoke and earth, their breath rising in pale clouds. Conversation was sparse. No one wanted to waste energy on words when their stomachs were empty. Instead, they shifted from one foot to the other, listening for the sound of the bakery door opening, the creak of hinges that meant the day's allotment had arrived. When bread did come, it was rarely what anyone remembered from before the war. The loaves were smaller, their crusts dark, their insides heavy with fillers. Sawdust, husks, and other substitutes were sometimes mixed with flour to stretch supplies. And though everyone knew it, no one complained. A single slice could keep hunger at bay for a little while, and that was all that mattered. Mothers divided the ration carefully at the table, slicing thin pieces for children first, then saving whatever crumbs remained for themselves. Fathers returning from long hours of work in factories or fields were given a portion too, though often smaller than what they needed to sustain their strength. Shops beyond the bakeries fared no better. Shelves that once held sacks of flour, jars of preserves, or tins of fish now stood bare, their wooden boards gathering dust. A few items appeared from time to time: cabbage, onions, sometimes salted fish, but they disappeared quickly, snatched up by those fortunate enough to arrive at the right moment. Word spread fast when something was available. A neighbor might whisper that potatoes had arrived at the market, and within minutes, half the village would be in line, clutching coins or ration cards, praying that the supply lasted long enough to reach them. For children, hunger was confusing and cruel. They remembered meals before the war, bowls of kasha, bread spread with a smear of jam, a rare piece of meat. Now their stomachs growled endlessly, and their games often revolved around the idea of food. They drew pictures of bread loaves on scraps of paper, or made up songs about soup, their imaginations reaching for the taste of something they could not have. Parents did their best to shield them, inventing stories that meals would be larger tomorrow, or that the army needed food more than they did. But even the youngest could feel the truth in their hollow bellies. The hunger shaped every decision. Families traded belongings for food, an old coat for a sack of potatoes, a pocket watch for a few loaves of bread. What once had been treasured heirlooms were now measured only by their ability to be exchanged for something edible. Entire markets sprang up in back alleys and barns, where people bartered quietly, always glancing over their shoulders for officials who might seize their goods. Yet even in these secret markets, food was scarce, and prices rose beyond reach. In the cities, the problem was even greater. With supply lines broken and factories evacuated, urban centers felt the squeeze most sharply. Crowds swarmed bakeries and food depots, ration cards clutched in trembling hands, while others scavenged in trash heaps or searched for weeds to boil into soups. People learned the edible plants that grew along roadsides, gathering nettles, sorrel, or dandelion leaves to stretch their meals. Nothing was wasted. Potato peels, stale crumbs, even the water left after boiling cabbage oil were consumed, because nothing could be spared. At night, hunger did not let people rest. Families lay awake in their narrow beds, listening to the growl of their own stomachs, the ache of emptiness stronger than the cold outside. Dreams often took the shape of food tables laden with bread, steaming bowls of soup, the smell of roasted meat, only to dissolve into bitter reality upon waking. For many, sleep itself became a way of escaping hunger, a few hours of forgetting, though the body never truly forgot. And yet, even in this scarcity, there was a kind of resilience. Neighbors shared what little they had, slipping a piece of bread to an old man too frail to stand in line, or carrying a pot of thin soup to a widow left alone after her husband was conscripted. Families pooled their rations, stretching them further together than they ever could apart. Hunger might gnaw at every stomach, but it also bound people together in quiet acts of compassion, small gestures of survival in a world that seemed intent on breaking them. The breadlines and empty shelves defined the rhythm of life during the invasion. They turned every day into a struggle for sustenance, every hour into a calculation of what could be spared, what could be saved, what could be endured. For the Soviet people, hunger was not just an absence of food, it was a constant presence, shaping their days, their choices, and their dreams. And it would remain with them, as sharp and unforgettable as the sound of distant planes in the sky. When people think of war, they often picture soldiers on battlefields, tanks rolling across fields, or bombers in the sky. But perhaps the most haunting image of all is the child in the middle of it, too young to understand why life has suddenly turned so dark, yet old enough to feel the weight of hunger, fear, and displacement. The Soviet Union's children during Hitler's invasion became unwilling witnesses to one of history's most devastating upheavals, and their lives were shaped by scarcity, separation, and the slow erosion of childhood itself. In the summer of 1941, when the first bombs fell and columns of smoke rose on the horizon, many children were still chasing one another through fields or splashing in rivers. Their worlds ended abruptly with the crack of gunfire and the distant rumble of artillery. Some villagers gathered the youngest together, trying to comfort them with stories or songs, but even the softest lullabies could not cover the strange silence that followed the destruction of a home or the sudden absence of a parent drafted into the Red Army. Schools, once noisy with recitations and laughter, quickly emptied. Teachers were drafted as nurses, clerks, or even soldiers. Blackboards gathered dust, their last lessons frozen in chalk. In some towns, classrooms were transformed into makeshift hospitals, where the sound of coughing and groaning replaced the murmur of children's voices. For many, education did not return until years later, if it returned at all. Instead, children learned lessons of survival, how to recognize the whistle of incoming shells, how to carry water without spilling a drop, because there might not be more tomorrow, how to barter a scrap of bread for a few potatoes, or how to spot edible weeds in a patch of grass. Games became shadows of their former selves. A stick could become a rifle in the imagination, and children pretended to march like the soldiers who had passed through their villages. But imitation often gave way to grim reality. Older children were tasked with collecting firewood, hauling buckets from wells, or watching younger siblings when their mothers spent hours standing in breadlines. Childhood innocence shrank with each passing week of war. The Soviet government, desperate to preserve industry and manpower, evacuated thousands of children eastward. Trains carried them away from bombed cities, their windows covered to shield them from strafing planes. Inside, The air was thick with the scent of fear and unwashed clothes. As children pressed close together, holding tight to the hands of brothers and sisters, parents often stayed behind, sending their children alone into the unknown. Letters became the only thread of connection, though many letters never arrived. For some, the last memory of home was a mother's tearful face fading from view as the train pulled away. In the cities, especially those under siege, children bore scars of hardship that even adults found crushing. In Leningrad, where famine tightened its grip, children's cheeks hollowed and their legs weakened from lack of food. Their play was reduced to conserving energy, to curling up beneath blankets during the long frozen nights, to counting crumbs. They dreamed of warm bread and imagined meals that never came. And yet, in the same city, some children scribbled in diaries, leaving behind hauntingly simple words that spoke of hunger, of cold, of longing for the ordinary life they had lost. Despite it all, resilience shone through. Children sang songs on evacuation trains, their voices a fragile thread of hope carried over endless plains. They invented small games with pebbles, bits of string, or carved wooden toys. In the villages, even as bombs fell in the distance, some managed to laugh, to chase each other between ruined fences, to find pockets of joy in an otherwise dark landscape. Their endurance became, in its own way, a quiet defiance of Hitler's invasion. For the children of the Soviet Union, war carved away innocence and replaced it with resilience. They grew up quickly, carrying burdens that should have belonged to adults. Many lost parents, homes, and schools, but they carried memories that no invasion could erase. And in the end, when peace returned, it was often through their eyes that the Soviet Union measured the cost of survival, not just in numbers and losses, but in the quiet years stolen from its youngest generation. When the men vanished from the villages and cities, summoned to the front lines, the fabric of everyday Soviet life did not unravel completely. It was rewoven by the hands of women. Mothers, sisters, and daughters became the backbone of a country under siege. Though many of them would never touch a rifle, their battleground was the field, the factory, and the hospital ward, and their weapon was endurance. In the countryside, women rose before dawn to harness horses, or more often, to harness themselves. With so many animals requisitioned for the army, plows were dragged by hand. The ground was heavy, the sun merciless, but the crops had to be sown. Entire collectives were run by women, old men, and children, laboring together to make sure there was food for both the army and for the civilians who remained. The harvests were smaller, the tools broken, yet the work went on. Even as artillery thundered in the distance, the rhythm of sickle and spade gave structure to days that might otherwise dissolve into fear. In the cities, factories became a world of sweat and sparks, where women in grease-stained overalls replaced husbands and brothers at the machines. Shifts stretched for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours, with little more than watery soup to keep them going. Factories that had once produced tractors were retooled for tanks. Sewing workshops now churned out uniforms, and every hand was needed. Many of the women had never seen a lathe or welding torch before 1941, yet necessity turned them into skilled workers overnight. The clang of metal and hiss of steam became a lullaby and a call to arms. All at once, hospitals overflowed as trains and carts arrived with the wounded. Here too, women bore the weight of war. Nurses, many barely out of girlhood, worked endless shifts, cleaning wounds, carrying stretchers, whispering comfort to soldiers far from home. Supplies were always short bandages torn from bedsheets, morphine stretched to the last drop, but the care did not falter. In these makeshift wards, death was a frequent visitor, yet so was resilience. A young nurse might bury her tears behind a tired smile, holding a soldier's hand until his final breath, only to rise and hurry to the next cot. The emotional burden was as heavy as the physical one. Every letter from the front brought both dread and hope. Women read by candlelight, clutching a scrap of paper that might say little more than "I am alive." They carried the silence between letters like stones in their chest. Some never received another message. Still, the work did not stop. The fields had to be plowed, the factories kept running, the wounded cared for. Grief could not be allowed to halt the rhythm of survival. In the evenings, when the factory sirens went quiet or the fields fell still, women gathered in kitchens and dormitories, sharing bread crusts and news. They braided each other's hair, hummed lullabies to restless children, and whispered encouragement into the shadows. Exhaustion pressed on them, but so did determination. They did not have rifles slung over their shoulders, yet in their own way, they were soldiers. Children often saw their mothers and grandmothers grow older before their eyes. The lines deepened, the shoulders stooped, but the work continued. A mother might spend the day welding armor plates and the night boiling potatoes for her family, then collapse into a brief, dreamless sleep before dawn called her back again. To the young, this was simply life war blurred into routine, and the quiet heroism of women became the unnoticed foundation of survival. What makes their story remarkable is not one moment of triumph, but the endless, ordinary perseverance. Women who had never thought of themselves as strong became the strongest people in their communities. They buried the fear, the hunger, the grief, and carried forward. Without guns, without medals, they fought their war, all the same, and it was their strength that kept the Soviet Union standing through its darkest hours. When the sun dipped below the horizon in the Soviet Union during the first years of Hitler's invasion, the world did not become peaceful. It became darker, more uncertain, and more dangerous. Blackout orders stretched across towns, villages, and cities alike. Windows were covered with heavy cloth, tar paper, or even mud smeared across the glass to stop a single glimmer from escaping. A single spark of light could call down death from the sky. Families learned to sit in silence, their homes cloaked in shadow, waiting out nights that felt endless. Evening used to mean warmth lamps lit, meals shared, laughter carrying down village streets. Now, as Hitler's Luftwaffe prowled overhead, night meant fear. The stillness outside was deceptive. Somewhere above, beyond the clouds, engines might be droning, circling, searching for the faintest sign of human presence. For Soviet families, the smallest comforts were traded for safety. Oil lamps were snuffed out. Radios were turned down so low their voices seemed like whispers from another world. Children were hushed before they could cry out. The darkness was a commandment that could not be broken. Life in the blackout was a test of the senses. People listened harder than they ever had before, waiting to hear the difference between the whistle of the wind and the ominous hum of a bomber's propellers. Dogs, too, seemed to sense the tension, their ears pricking, their growls low, as if warning of what might come. Families gathered close in one room, blankets pulled tight, not so much for warmth but for the reassurance of touch. Many slept on the floor, away from windows, fearing broken glass as much as fire. Children learned quickly that bedtime stories were whispered in near silence. Instead of fairy tales, mothers and grandmothers recited fragments of memory, things safe enough to fill the hours: how the harvest used to smell, how markets once buzzed with chatter, how streets glowed with lanterns before the war. These small recollections became a lifeline, holding back despair. Childhood itself had dimmed, like the extinguished lamps, replaced by a strange mixture of fear and endurance. The blackouts changed the rhythm of daily life. People rose earlier, making the most of daylight to finish chores and gather what food they could. Markets closed by afternoon, and streets emptied quickly. A hush fell over neighborhoods as twilight came, as if everyone collectively held their breath. Curfews were enforced, but in truth, few dared to wander in the dark anyway. The thought of being caught outside, beneath a sky where every shadow might conceal death, was enough to keep doors firmly bolted. And yet, there was a kind of resilience in the darkness. In cities like Moscow and Leningrad, citizens learned to walk the streets with tiny flashlights, beams carefully hidden in cupped hands, guiding steps without betraying their presence. In villages, lanterns were carried inside clay jars with only the smallest crack left open. Farmers whispered to one another in the fields before dawn, planning their work with gestures rather than words, so as not to break the heavy silence. Humanity bent itself to survive, reshaping its customs to match the war's demands. There were moments, too, when the blackout brought unexpected stillness. In the deep quiet, without light or distraction, people heard the world as it truly was: the creak of wooden beams, the soft scratching of mice, the slow rhythm of breathing from those they loved. In these hushed hours, many clung to thoughts of peace, imagining what it would be like to light a lamp again without fear, to walk openly beneath stars without wondering if fire might fall from the heavens. Nights without light left their mark on Soviet memory. They were nights of dread, yes, but also of endurance. Whole generations learned to live in silence and shadow, to press their lives into the smallest spaces, waiting for the dawn to promise safety. For many, that dawn never truly came. Yet in the middle of the war's long nights, the people of the Soviet Union endured. One breath, one heartbeat, one candleless hour at a time. The war stretched on, and for many families in the Soviet Union, hope came folded into thin pieces of paper. Letters from the front, sometimes nothing more than a scrap of lined notebook paper. Sometimes a postcard with hurried scribbles became treasures guarded more carefully than bread, more carefully even than money. In the quiet evenings, when the day's work was done and the rations had been boiled into thin soup, mothers, wives, and children would gather by the table under the glow of a candle stub to read and reread every word. The letters were rarely long. Soldiers had little time, and the censors had strict rules about what could and could not be written. They often began with the same phrases: "I am alive and in good health. Do not worry about me. How are you?" These words, simple as they were, carried immense weight. They meant another day survived, another battle endured, another chance that the family might one day be whole again. Even a few lines gave a fragile thread of connection between the front lines and the homes left behind. For children, the letters brought a strange comfort. A father's handwriting, crooked from writing in a trench or on the hood of a truck, became something sacred. Mothers would trace the words with their fingers, reading them aloud again and again until the children could recite them by heart. Sometimes the soldier would draw a tiny picture and outline of a bird, or a flower remembered from the village. To the child, it felt like a secret gift, a piece of their father smuggled back through the chaos of war. But letters could also wound as much as they soothed. Days, weeks, or months could pass without word. Families learned to wait at the post office, or by the village messenger, their hearts racing at the sight of an envelope. And when nothing came, fear began to seep in. Was he alive? Was he injured, unable to write? Or had the letters simply been lost in the sea of millions moving through the Soviet postal system? The silence was sometimes worse than bad news, for at least bad news gave an answer, an ending. Those who did receive news of loss often received it not in a personal letter, but in the dreaded poharanka, the official death notice, printed on stiff paper with official stamps. It was clinical, cold, and devastating. Families who had been clinging to each word from the front now held in their hands a final message that said simply, their loved one was gone. These notices slipped into hands without ceremony, often left households in silence for days. No words were enough to fill the void. For those still waiting, the sound of the mail carrier's footsteps could spark both joy and dread. In many small towns, people gathered near the central post office when new deliveries came in. A woman opening an envelope with trembling hands might burst into tears, sometimes from happiness, sometimes from grief. Neighbors comforted one another, for nearly everyone was waiting for someone. Soldiers knew this too. They wrote not only for themselves but for the survival of their families' spirits. They could not always speak of the horrors they saw, but they could send warmth. They wrote about remembering the taste of apples from their orchard, about dreaming of the riverbank where they once fished, about missing the smell of fresh bread baked on a Sunday morning. These details, simple and ordinary, were powerful because they reminded families of what they were fighting for: home, normalcy, and the promise that life might one day return to what it had been. Some letters were carried in secret ways. Soldiers on leave might take bundles of notes from comrades and hand them directly to wives and mothers in distant towns. Others relied on chance, slipping folded paper into the hands of railway workers or passing them along with retreating refugees. Every letter, no matter how it arrived, was a small miracle in itself. And yet, over time, as the war dragged on, families adjusted to the rhythm of silence. Many learned not to expect a letter at all, so that when one came, it felt like an unexpected blessing. They stored them in boxes, wrapped in cloth, tucked into the corners of drawers, or even sewn into clothing to protect them. The fragile sheets of paper became symbols of endurance, tokens of connection that somehow survived the firestorm of invasion. In the hush of blackout nights, families would whisper the words once more before sleep. A mother would repeat her husband's lines softly to her children, assuring them that he was thinking of them, even far away at the front. The children drifted into dreams with their father's words echoing like a lullaby. The letters were never just letters. They were anchors in a storm, tiny bridges across miles of mud, ice, and blood. The first true winter of the war arrived with a cruelty that seemed almost personal. In the Soviet Union, winters were never mild, but the winter of 1941 into 1942 pressed itself against every wall, every breath, every living body with an unrelenting weight. The rivers froze thick and solid, the wind cut like shards of glass, and the cold seeped into bones that no blanket or stove could properly warm. It was as though nature itself had chosen to join the war, indifferent to the suffering it caused, but merciless in its reach. Daily life shrank to the simplest and harshest of tasks: keeping warm, finding food, and enduring. Families wrapped themselves in layers of patched clothing, stuffing newspaper between coats for insulation. The breath of each person rose in visible clouds, even inside their homes, where walls of wood or brick were no match against the endless cold. Frost crept across windows, leaving delicate but mocking patterns of white lace, reminding those who saw it that the warmth they longed for remained far away. In towns and cities, furniture disappeared piece by piece, not from theft, but from necessity. Wooden chairs, tables, shelves, even floorboards were fed into stoves to create a few hours of fragile heat. A bed might remain in a room, but the wardrobe it once stood beside could be gone, chopped and burned in a desperate effort to hold back frostbite. Families would huddle together, often in one room, cooling their body warmth beneath thin blankets, listening to the crackling of a small fire that never seemed to last long enough. Hunger became sharper as the cold deepened. The ration cards promised bread, but often the loaves were smaller, stretched with sawdust or husks, barely resembling food at all. In the bitter cold, people grew weaker, faster, their bodies demanding more than they could ever receive. Each day became a careful calculation: when to stand in line, how long the wait might last, whether there would be anything left once their turn came. Parents gave up their portions to children. Elderly grandparents insisted they were not hungry, though their frail bodies betrayed them. The soldiers at the front suffered in parallel, writing letters that spoke of numb fingers, of boots frozen solid, of snow that blinded and concealed alike. Yet the civilians, too, fought their own private war against winter. Women scraped frost from inside the walls of their apartments. Children, too young to understand the full scope of the war, learned quickly how to gather scraps of wood, how to search for coal dust, how to carry buckets of water through streets layered in ice. The silence of winter was punctuated only by the low whistle of the wind and the distant groans of ice shifting in rivers. Nights were longer, darker, the blackout curtains stayed drawn, and families sat close by candlelight, their shadows flickering along the walls. Stories were told to pass the hours, stories of summers past, of harvests, of days when food and warmth were plentiful. There were stories meant to keep hope alive, yet sometimes they sounded more like memories of a vanished world. Despite the misery, there were small acts of endurance that gave strength. A mother saving a lump of sugar for her child's birthday, neighbors sharing what little they had, knowing that survival was easier together. A soldier's letter arriving in the coldest week of January, carrying words of reassurance that melted hearts even if it could not melt the snow. The winter of 1941-42 tested the very limits of human endurance. And yet, people survived it. Not all, but many, carrying with them the lesson that survival was not always about strength or victory. It was about persistence, about refusing to give in to the silence and the frost. In the Soviet Union, that winter was remembered not only as a season of suffering, but as a season when life itself became an act of resistance. When the German armies surged deeper into Soviet lands, not every village was able to evacuate. For countless communities, the war did not arrive with the chance to flee, but with the heavy boots of an occupying army. The villagers that once lived in quiet rhythms of planting, harvesting, and gathering around stoves at night now woke each morning to the sound of foreign voices and the sight of strangers carrying rifles. The air itself felt different, colder, more uncertain, as if even the familiar paths through the fields were no longer safe. The first days of occupation were always the most jarring. German units would arrive, often with trucks and horses, and immediately lay down rules. A new order appeared, posted on boards or nailed to doors, written in stern language and backed with the threat of punishment. Curfews were imposed. Bread, milk, and livestock were seized. Families who had little were forced to give up more, while those who resisted risked everything. For many villagers, survival meant quiet obedience, yet obedience did not guarantee safety. Children sensed the change most keenly. They were told not to run or shout, not to draw attention. Games that once filled the lanes of the village vanished, replaced by silence and watchful eyes. The schoolhouse, if it still stood, was no longer a place of learning. Sometimes it was turned into a barracks, sometimes a storehouse, and sometimes it stood empty, a reminder of life before the invasion. For adults, each day became a negotiation with fear. Some villagers tried to keep their heads down, doing what was ordered while hoping to protect their families. Others quietly resisted, hiding food, passing along information, or sheltering Red Army soldiers who had been cut off. The danger of being caught was immense. Punishments were swift and brutal, designed to keep the population subdued. Even a rumor of helping partisans could bring down reprisals on an entire household. Yet despite the fear, small acts of defiance endured. Women might bake an extra loaf of bread in secret and slip it to a hungry neighbor. A boy might sneak into the forest with news for the partisans. A priest might whisper encouragement during a hurried prayer service. These moments of quiet bravery, invisible to the occupiers, kept hope alive in the hearts of many. The occupiers, too, understood the power of silence and obedience. They encouraged collaboration, offering food or protection to those who would cooperate. For some villagers, this created unbearable choices. Helping the enemy meant survival for one's family, but it also meant shame, mistrust, and resentment from neighbors. The occupation fractured communities, dividing them in ways that could last long after the war. Nights were the heaviest. Families gathered in dim rooms, whispering about the day's events, wondering what the next dawn would bring. Candles burned low, often hidden from windows. The fear of footsteps outside lingered long after curfew. Parents tried to reassure their children, but even their voices carried the tremor of uncertainty. And still, life found ways to continue. A cow might still be milked before sunrise. A child might still hum an old folk song while drawing in the dirt. A grandmother might still recite prayers while stirring thin soup over the fire. These small fragments of normality were precious, reminders that life had not been completely extinguished by occupation. For those who lived under German control, survival was a test of endurance not only of the body, but of the spirit. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and with every season that passed, the longing for liberation grew stronger. Villagers clung to whispers of the Red Army advancing, of battles turning in their favor, of the promise that someday the invaders would be driven out. Until then, they lived one day at a time, in quiet struggle, under the weight of a sky that no longer felt like their own. The forests of the Soviet Union had always been vast, deep, and endless in their silence. For centuries, they had been both a source of sustenance and a place of fear, a wilderness that could swallow villages whole. But during the years of Hitler's invasion, the forests became something else entirely. They became the hidden lungs of resistance, where partisans, young and old, moved like shadows among the pines and birches. Life under German occupation had made the choice clear for some: obey the new masters and survive under their harsh rules, or risk everything to resist. For villagers who lived near the forests, whispers traveled quickly of bands of fighters who slipped in and out at night, striking railways, sabotaging German supply lines, and then vanishing into the trees. To the occupiers, they were criminals. To the villagers, they were both hope and danger. For those who joined the partisans, daily life was stripped to its harshest essentials. They carried few weapons, sometimes rifles left behind from the retreating Red Army, sometimes hunting shotguns taken from farms, and often nothing more than their determination. Food was scarce, and many relied on the kindness and bravery of villagers who risked their lives to bring bread, potatoes, or a jug of milk deep into the woods. A single act of generosity, handing a crust of bread to a partisan, could bring death if discovered by German patrols. And yet, villagers continued to do it, quietly, secretly, as though the bond between the people and the fighters was something older and stronger than fear. At night, when the villages were dark and occupied, the forests came alive with whispers and movement. Fires were lit, only rarely, hidden deep in ravines or shielded by branches, their glow too dangerous. Instead, partisans learned to live with the cold, wrapping themselves in whatever scraps of cloth they could find. The forest floor became their bed, the stars, their roof. They moved by moonlight, their steps muffled by pine needles and snow. The danger of reprisals was constant. Everyone knew the rules. If partisans struck a German patrol, the occupiers might return and burn down a village, hang men in the square, or drag families away as punishment. This knowledge weighed heavily on villagers and fighters alike. Yet still, resistance persisted. It was not loud or heroic in the way of grand battles. It was quiet, stubborn, and rooted in survival. To leave the occupiers unchallenged was unthinkable, even if the price was steep. Children in the villages often became messengers. They were less likely to be suspected by German soldiers, and their small hands could carry folded slips of paper, hidden inside a boot or tucked into a pocket. A boy of 12 might walk calmly through a checkpoint, carrying a message that would change the course of a raid. The bravery of these children was spoken of in whispers, never openly, for fear that even words might bring retribution. The forests themselves shaped this secret war. In winter, the snow muffled footsteps and froze streams solid, making paths treacherous but also giving cover. In summer, the thick leaves made it easier to vanish, though mosquitoes and hunger gnawed at the fighters relentlessly. Through it all, the partisans adapted, their strength not in weaponry but in patience and the will to endure. Sometimes, stories spread of daring strikes, a train carrying supplies derailed by explosives late in the night, or a German officer ambushed on a lonely road. These tales brought a fragile sense of pride to villagers, a reminder that they were not powerless. But for every tale of defiance, there were also darker stories: villages destroyed, neighbors arrested, families grieving silently. Still, the forest resistance endured because it had to. The invasion had taken homes, families, and fields, but it had not yet taken away the will to fight. The partisans were not faceless soldiers. They were fathers, brothers, daughters, and neighbors, carrying on a war of shadows because survival demanded it. Their presence gave hope, even when that hope was laced with fear. And so, as the war pressed on, the forests became both a sanctuary and a battlefield, an endless green sea where the Soviets clung to their determination in the face of overwhelming force. To live in those years was to understand that resistance did not always roar with cannons. Sometimes, it breathed quietly under the shelter of the trees, waiting, enduring, surviving. The story of the Soviet Union during Hitler's invasion cannot be told without turning our eyes eastward past the smoke of burning villages and ruined cities to the great industrial lifeline that was forged beyond the Ural Mountains. For many who had been forced to leave behind their homes in the West, the journey ended in sprawling makeshift towns of wood and steel, where the new battle was not fought with rifles but with furnaces, drills, and assembly lines. When the Germans advanced deeper into Soviet territory in 1941, thousands of factories were dismantled piece by piece. Machines, lathes, boilers, and presses were loaded onto trains and sent hundreds, sometimes thousands, of kilometers east. Entire industrial cities were uprooted in a matter of weeks, as if the Soviet Union had decided to lift its own skeleton and carry it across the continent. The destination was often the Urals, a vast natural barrier where mountains rose like a wall, shielding the factories from the threat of German bombers. The workers who arrived here were not the men who had once run the plants. Most of those men had gone to the front, leaving the factories to women, teenagers, and the elderly. The journey itself had been grueling. Families had crowded into boxcars, huddled together with the very machines they would soon operate, eating cold bread as trains rattled endlessly through forests and steppe. Many arrived to find nothing waiting for them: no housing, no proper workshops, only cleared patches of earth and piles of timber. And yet, there was no pause. The work began the moment the trains were unloaded. Women carried beams, children hauled bricks, elderly men hammered together barracks that would serve as both homes and workshops. There were no walls to keep out the bitter wind at first, so workers tied scarves over their faces and labored until their hands went numb. At night, they slept beside the very machines they had unloaded, their breath rising like smoke in the unheated sheds. When production finally began, it did so under impossible conditions. Factories ran around the clock in shifts that blurred the difference between day and night. Steam billowed from pipes. Sparks showered from cutting wheels. The clang of metal striking metal was constant. A woman who once had been a schoolteacher now poured molten steel into molds. A boy of 15 carried ammunition crates that weighed as much as he did. A grandmother, who had never left her village before, stitched padded jackets for soldiers at a sewing machine she barely knew how to use. Meals were meager, sometimes just thin cabbage soup and a slice of dark bread. Hunger gnawed at every stomach, but production quotas still loomed. Posters on the walls reminded them that every shell, every rifle, every tank part might mean survival for a soldier at the front. Workers pushed themselves until exhaustion became as natural as breathing. Falling asleep at a machine was not unusual. Waking with burns, cuts, or frostbitten fingers was almost expected. And yet, there was pride in the exhaustion. To be part of these factories was to be part of the defense of the nation itself. Rumors spread that the tanks rolling out of Ural factories went straight to Moscow, that the planes assembled in freezing hangars were the ones turning the tide above the battlefield. People clung to these rumors because they needed to believe that their labor was not simply drudgery but survival. Life outside the factory walls was no easier. Families lived in crude wooden huts or even dugouts carved into the earth. Fires burned in metal barrels to provide heat. Entire families slept in one room, wrapped in whatever rags or blankets they could find. Children did not go to school so much as they learned their lessons at the side of the machines, copying their mothers or fathers until they, too, could take a place on the line. Childhood in the Urals was measured not in toys or play, but in shifts and production numbers. The winters were brutal. Workers trudged through snowdrifts before dawn, stamping their feet to keep the blood moving. Tools froze to bare hands. Breath turned into frost on scarves and collars. Still, the factories did not stop. The idea of stopping was unthinkable. A lull in production was not just a delay, It was a death sentence for soldiers waiting for supplies. And yet, despite the hardship, the factories behind the Urals became symbols of resilience. They were proof that the Soviet Union, even under the most crushing of blows, could shift its weight, adapt, and endure. For the workers themselves, there was no romance in the labor-only exhaustion and hunger. But history would later record that these hidden cities of steel and smoke gave the Red Army the weapons it needed to hold the line, and eventually, to push back. For those who lived it, however, the memory was not of triumph but of survival. The hiss of steam, the crackle of furnaces, the endless pounding of hammers, these sounds were the lullabies of war for the millions, who built victory with blistered hands and sleepless nights. And as the factories roared, the people who toiled there whispered only one thought to themselves as they collapsed onto their bunks. If they could endure today, perhaps tomorrow the war would begin to turn. When the machinery of war consumed every waking hour, when bread was scarce, and the nights were cold, what kept people from collapsing under despair was not just food or warmth, but something quieter: songs whispered in kitchens, poems recited under blankets, and music played on battered accordions in airless barracks. In the Soviet Union during Hitler's invasion, culture was never a luxury, it was a lifeline. Across the cities and villages, music rose up where silence might have otherwise swallowed people whole. In cramped apartments where several families lived together, evenings often ended with someone pulling out a balalaika or a violin saved from a more peaceful past. Children leaned against the stove, their cheeks red from the fire's glow, listening to mothers sing lullabies that had been passed down for generations. Even as bombs shook the walls or rumors carried word of entire towns falling to the enemy, these songs created a fragile shield, a reminder that life had not yet been stolen away completely. On the front lines, soldiers carried scraps of paper with handwritten poems tucked inside their breast pockets. Some were lines of Pushkin or Lermontov, others hastily scribbled verses from fellow comrades. These were read aloud in dugouts, sometimes by candlelight, sometimes in complete darkness when the flame risked drawing enemy fire. A single poem, spoken softly, might bring a hush over exhausted men. It reminded them of home, of the birch trees they left behind, of rivers frozen in the winter and meadows blooming in spring. The verses gave the war-weary soldiers something to cling to, a thread connecting them to the lives they hoped to return to someday. In besieged Leningrad, where hunger gnawed at every body and death walked through the streets daily, music became a weapon of resistance. The famous performance of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942, played while the city starved, stands as one of the most haunting testaments to the power of art. Musicians, many weak with hunger, gathered their strength to rehearse and perform. The symphony was broadcast on loudspeakers across the city and even directed toward enemy lines. The message was clear: the people of Leningrad would not be silenced, even as they starved. For ordinary citizens, hearing that music was like breathing air into collapsing lungs. Yet it was not only the grand concerts that mattered. In small villages, folk songs whispered in the dark carried just as much weight. Women sang while working in the fields, their voices rising above the creak of wagons and the swish of sickles. These songs were not about the war itself, but about love, loss, and nature. In a time when daily life was filled with ration cards, fear, and exhaustion, singing of rivers, horses, or the turning of the seasons reminded them that the world beyond war still existed. For children, music and poetry became lessons in survival. School was disrupted, but teachers, when they could, taught through stories and verse. A classroom might have no chalk, no notebooks, not even walls, but the rhythm of a poem recited in unison or a song sung together could keep children's minds steady. In their play, they made up chants that echoed the worries of adults, turning fear into rhyme so it felt less heavy. Even in the darkest shelters, under blackout curtains, where families huddled during air raids, voices would rise, sometimes softly, sometimes defiantly. They filled the silence with melodies. A candle stub might flicker, casting shadows on the walls as someone whispered the words of an old lullaby. Outside, the sky burned or shook with the rumble of artillery, but inside, the fragile sound of human voices became proof that the war had not completely taken their souls. In the east, behind the Urals, where factories thundered day and night, music followed workers too. Exhausted men and women, their hands blistered and lungs coated with soot, would hum as they worked. A quiet tune carried through the clatter of machinery, soft enough not to slow production but strong enough to remind each worker that they were still human. After long shifts, when they collapsed onto bunks near the factory floor, some would sing themselves to sleep, their voices low, cracked, and weary. It was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but it was deeply human. Songs and poems were not only private comforts, but also carried messages of endurance. Propaganda posters and radio broadcasts often leaned on cultural memory. The state encouraged patriotic songs, but people quietly sang older ones, weaving together the official with the personal. To the authorities, a march might inspire productivity. To ordinary citizens, a lullaby might soothe a starving child. Both were needed to survive. In a time when so much was dictated, what food was available, what news could be spoken, even when to turn on or off a light, songs remained something personal. They belonged to the people, whether shared in barracks, whispered in bunkers, or hummed in fields. They were not always about victory or patriotism. Many were simply about love, longing, and hope, things the war could not erase. And so, night after night, even as bombs fell and families scattered, the Soviet Union sang, not loudly, not always beautifully, but persistently, stubbornly. These were the songs in the dark, carrying people through one of the harshest chapters of their lives. The story of the Soviet Union during Hitler's invasion cannot be told without pausing inside the city of Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg, where one of the most terrible blockades in human history unfolded. From September 1941 to January 1944, the city was cut off from the outside world. What had been a proud cultural capital became an island of endurance, sealed by German troops, artillery, and starvation. At first, when the German army drew close, there was disbelief. Leningrad had always seemed untouchable. Its elegant canals, palaces, and proud avenues felt distant from the brutality of the front lines. But within days of the encirclement, the reality became impossible to deny. Warehouses were bombed, food stores destroyed, and rations were reduced to levels nobody could live on for long. Families who once strolled the Nevsky Prospect now stood in bread queues stretching for blocks, waiting hours for a ration so small it could fit into the palm of a hand. Bread, when it did arrive, was not truly bread anymore. It was a dark, thin, heavy block, made with ground sawdust, oil cakes, and scraps of whatever could be milled. Adults received a few hundred grams per day, children, even less. Each crumb became precious. Families cut slices into the thinnest possible slivers, sucking on them slowly, sometimes soaking them in hot water to make them last a little longer. For many, this bread was the only food for weeks at a time. The cold winter of 1940-142 only deepened the misery. Temperatures dropped to -30°C. Fuel was gone, and families dismantled furniture, burned books, and even tore up parquet floors to feed their stoves. Many apartments grew bare, stripped down to walls and cold iron beds, their inhabitants wrapped in every scrap of fabric they could find. The streets froze, littered with silent figures. A person could step out one morning to fetch water from a frozen canal and see, on the path, bodies lying in the snow, neighbors, strangers, fellow survivors who had simply fallen and not risen again. And yet, daily life continued in strange, quiet rhythms. Workers still trudged to factories, though their bodies were weak and their steps slow. Children, when they could, still gathered for makeshift lessons in freezing classrooms, writing with trembling hands while their teachers whispered words of encouragement. Some carried notebooks filled with more drawings than text sketches of bread loaves, steaming soup bowls, warm stoves. Hunger entered every thought, every dream. Water too became a trial. With pipes frozen, families were forced to hack at the thick ice of rivers and canals, carrying heavy buckets back home. The sound of sledges dragging water barrels across the snow became a common music of the city. Often these barrels were pulled not by horses, but by children, wrapped in scarves, their faces red with frostbite. Amid this despair, there were still fragments of beauty and culture. Musicians gathered in freezing halls, their instruments brittle from the cold, to play symphonies for starving audiences. Poets scribbled verses on scraps of paper, words of endurance and hope. The great composer Dmitri Shostakovich wrote his 7th symphony, the Leningrad Symphony, during the blockade, and when it was performed in August 1942, loudspeakers carried it across the city and even across German lines. For those who heard it, the music was more than a performance, it was proof that the city still lived. Silence, too, was part of daily life. Streets grew quieter as the months dragged on, footsteps slower, conversations fewer. Families often sat in dim rooms, conserving strength, waiting for time to pass. The ticking of a clock, the whisper of a candle, the crack of ice shifting on the river all seemed louder in the emptiness of hunger. But even in silence, there was resilience. Neighbors shared what little they had, dividing a single slice of bread into 3, or offering a few spoonfuls of watery soup. Children carried notes between apartments, checking in on the elderly, carrying messages that said little but meant much. We are still alive. The siege stretched on for 872 days. By the time the blockade finally lifted in January 1944, hundreds of thousands had perished, starvation, cold, and bombardment claiming them. Yet those who endured carried with them a quiet dignity, a memory of having survived the darkest hunger imaginable. For the ordinary people of Leningrad, daily life during the siege was not measured in grand battles or sweeping movements of armies, but in the small victories of survival. A crust of bread shared, a pot of boiling water secured, a candle lit against the long night. And in these small victories lay the spirit that allowed the city, though broken, to remain beneath the cracked streets of a Soviet city, where artillery echoed like distant thunder and the air was heavy with dust and smoke. There were places where life tried to go on. One of those places was the schoolroom in the bunker. The walls were rough concrete, lined with faint chalk markings and faded posters that had been rescued from the ruins above. The air smelled of damp stone and candle wax. Children sat on wooden benches, some scavenged from collapsed buildings, others built quickly by their fathers before they left for the front. Their coats were patched, their boots oversized or too small, and their stomachs growled with hunger. Yet here, in this dim room, underground, they were still students. The teacher's voice, low but steady, carried across the bunker. She wore no uniform, no fine clothes, just a worn scarf pulled tightly over her head. In her hand was a stub of chalk, broken in half and sharpened like a pencil. The blackboard was chipped, but she used every inch of it to write numbers, words, and scraps of poetry that the children copied on scraps of paper or pressed into memory. Bombs rumbled in the distance, sometimes close enough to shake dust from the ceiling. The children would pause, their eyes darting upward, waiting to see if the next strike was near. Then, when the sound passed, the lesson continued. Arithmetic problems mixed with lessons on history, stories of Russian fairy tales, and even songs sung in whispers so they would not draw attention. For many, this was the only normality left. School was no longer about grades or exams, it was about survival of the spirit. Learning reminded the children that life had existed before the war and that it might exist again after. Each word on the chalkboard was not just instruction, but a promise that they were more than the war that surrounded them. When class ended, the children did not run out to play in the streets, they could not. Instead, they returned to their families in the dark corners of the shelter, carrying with them a poem memorized, a sum solved, or a song whispered. In a world of fear and silence, the schoolroom in the bunker was a fragile flame, flickering but At night, when the air along the tracks grew cold and still, trains arrived not with cheering soldiers heading to the front, but with the broken ones returning. Their carriages were not filled with music or laughter, but with the muted groans of pain, the rattle of stretchers, and the smell of iodine and damp wool. These were the silent trains of the wounded. Windows were often blacked out, and the cars had been stripped bare to hold rows of bunks. Doctors and nurses moved through the dim light of lanterns, their hands worn raw from tending to wounds that seemed endless. Some soldiers lay wrapped in heavy blankets, staring blankly at the ceiling. Others whispered to one another, clinging to fragments of memory, while a few murmured songs from home in voices so weak they seemed almost part of the wind. At the stations, families waited in the dark, uncertain who would return. The sound of brakes, squealing was enough to bring hearts into throats. Mothers clutched shawls around their shoulders, children hid behind them, and wives searched the faces that appeared in the hot flight. Some reunions were filled with tears of relief, others with quiet despair at what the war had taken: an arm, a leg, sometimes even the light of recognition in the eyes of the man they had once known. The wounded were carried into makeshift hospitals, often schools, factories, or barns converted into wards. Beds were lined so close together that the air was thick with the sound of breathing, coughing, and whispered prayers. Nurses worked until their hands trembled, sewing uniforms by day and stitching wounds by night. Yet, in the silence of those trains and the crowded hospitals, there was also dignity. Soldiers shared bread crusts with one another, or offered a hand to steady a comrade rising on crutches. Families sat beside beds, telling stories of home, reminding the wounded that beyond the pain, life still waited. The silent trains carried not just bodies, but the weight of sacrifice, a procession of endurance that never made headlines, but spoke louder than any victory parade. When the armies moved on, what they left behind was silence. Villages that had once bustled with market chatter and the cries of children were reduced to shells of blackened timbers and broken walls. Roofs sagged, doors hung crookedly, and the smell of ash lingered long after the smoke had blown away. It was a silence heavy with absence. And then, as spring crept back across the land, something unexpected began to stir. The snow melted into the scorched fields, trickling through the charred furrows where wheat had once grown. From cracks in the ruined earth, small green shoots appeared. They seemed fragile, almost uncertain, yet day by day they reached higher. In the courtyards where walls had collapsed, wildflowers bloomed, as if indifferent to the destruction that surrounded them. The people who returned to these villages walked slowly, their footsteps crunching on burned wood and broken glass. They carried little more than tools, buckets, and bundles of belongings salvaged from sellers or neighbors' hands. They looked upon the ruins with weary eyes, but when they saw the flowers, or heard the distant call of a bird nesting again in the rafters of a wrecked barn, something inside them softened. Children who had known only hunger and hiding picked dandelions and placed them in chipped jars, as if to remind their parents that beauty had not vanished completely. Women planted gardens in the blackened soil, turning over earth that still smelled of smoke. Men patched roofs with whatever boards they could find, while the new grass pushed stubbornly through the rubble beneath their feet. Springtime did not erase the ruins. It did not fill empty chairs or rebuild shattered homes, but it whispered gently of persistence. That life, in its quiet way, was stronger than war. The sight of green against blackened stone, of blossoms rising from the ash, gave the survivors a strength that no speech or order could provide. In the ruins of war, the first flowers of spring became symbols of endurance, silent promises that even after the harshest winters, the earth still remembered how to heal. For those who lived under the shadow of occupation, time itself seemed to change. Days stretched endlessly, filled with the routines of survival, fetching water under watchful eyes, bartering scraps of food, avoiding the sudden danger of a soldier's glance. Yet beneath the weariness, there was always a pulse of anticipation, a quiet question whispered in kitchens and barns. When will they come back? Years of occupation wore down both body and spirit. Entire towns lived in a hush, careful not to speak too loudly, careful not to trust too easily. The occupiers controlled bread, controlled work, even controlled silence. Families learned to hide their radios in cellars, muffling the sound with blankets as they tuned to faint, crackling signals from Moscow. On stormy nights, when static filled the air, they leaned in closer, straining to hear a single sentence, a single clue that the Red Army was near. Hope was dangerous, yet impossible to extinguish. Rumors spread like wildfire through villages. An offensive had begun to the west. Soviet tanks had crossed a river. A partisan had seen soldiers in new uniforms moving closer. None of it could be proven, but each whisper carried a warmth that helped people through another hungry day. Mothers clung to these fragments, telling children at bedtime that the war would not last forever, that the soldiers would come, that soon the sound of boots would change from menace to salvation. But hope was shadowed by fear. For with liberation came uncertainty. Villagers knew well the punishment that could follow even the suspicion of sympathy for Soviet troops. Some feared reprisals before the Red Army could arrive. Others dreaded that the front itself might wash over them again, bringing another round of fire and destruction. Liberation meant the end of waiting, but not necessarily the end of suffering. Still, there was a rhythm to hope. In the evenings, as people gathered in darkened rooms, voices dropped to whispers and stories were told about brothers fighting at the front, about rumors of great battles. The stories circled like embers, faint but glowing, passed carefully from one heart to another, and then, sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, distant thunder would roll across the horizon, not the thunder of storms, but of artillery. Windows rattled, and people froze in their beds, listening with wide eyes. The sound meant something was moving, something was shifting. It could bring destruction again, but it also meant the Red Army might be drawing closer. Waiting for liberation was a test of patience, of endurance, of holding on to identity when everything was stripped away. It was the space between despair and renewal. And when the day finally came when Soviet soldiers entered a town, weary and mud-stained, but carrying the flag, many could hardly believe it. After years of silence, the long-awaited footsteps of liberation sounded almost like a dream. When the war finally began to loosen its grip, it did not end with a sudden silence. It ended slowly, like a long winter melting into spring. Villages that had known only hunger and fear began to hear new sounds. The rumble of carts carrying soldiers home, the footsteps of men who had been gone for years, their uniforms faded, their faces lined by hardship. For many, the return was overwhelming. Mothers ran to meet sons they had last seen as boys, now hardened into men with weary eyes. Wives embraced husbands who seemed both familiar and foreign, carrying scars that spoke of battles never described. Children, who had grown taller in their absence, hesitated before running forward, unsure at first if the figure before them was truly their father. And yet, in these reunions, joy mingled with disbelief, as though life itself had been given back. But not every family waited with such fortune. Along the same roads where soldiers limped home, others carried small bundles, the last possessions of men who would never return. Letters had been lost, graves unmarked, and many households lived with the silence of not knowing. For every reunion filled with tears of relief, there was another filled with mourning, neighbors sitting quietly with those left behind. The rebuilding began almost at once. Fields burned and the fighting were plowed again, seeds pressed into ash-filled soil with hope that life would grow once more. Roofs were patched with scavenged boards, walls repaired stone by stone. Villages that had been nothing but ruins began to hum faintly, with life smoke rising again from chimneys, the ring of hammers echoing across courtyards. The soldiers who returned often spoke little of the front. Their silence was its own language, carried into the evenings when families sat together by weak candlelight. Stories were rare, and when they did emerge, they were softened, told in fragments. For most, the war lived on behind their eyes, even as they tried to return to plowing, mending, and living as before. The slow return of soldiers was not only a return of men, but of rhythm, of seasons, of community. It was the start of learning how to live again, not in the shadow of destruction, but in the fragile promise of peace. When the war finally ended, it did not vanish from people's lives as quickly as the armies marched away. Victory brought relief, but it also brought silence, an uneasy, heavy silence that hung over villages, towns, and cities alike. The guns were gone, the planes no longer droned overhead, but the memory of their terror remained. The war left its shadow, and it lingered over everything. For those who had survived the long years of invasion and occupation, the world looked different. Even familiar places felt altered. Streets that once held neighbors and laughter were now lined with ruins or empty lots where buildings had stood. Entire families were missing. Their absence was as visible as the rubble itself. Every gap at a dinner table, every doorway without its owner, spoke of the cost. Yet life continued, because it had to. People gathered the fragments of what they had left, and began again. A torn coat was patched and worn another winter. A broken wagon wheel was mended and set rolling. A child's laughter returned to the air, faint at first, then steady, reminding the weary that tomorrow still held meaning. In the face of absence, resilience took root like grass between stones. The Soviet Union carried more than physical scars. The war had carved itself into memory. Mothers who had stood in bread lines for hours remembered the gnawing hunger even when food returned. Soldiers who had survived the front carried unspoken images of battle that crept into their dreams. Farmers who had buried seed in burned fields never forgot the sight of blackened soil. These memories passed quietly from one generation to the next, carried in stories whispered in kitchens, or in the silence of those who could not bring themselves to speak. Children born after the war grew up in this shadow too. They did not see the battles, but they saw the lines on their parents' faces. The way an old man paused when he heard the distant thud of thunder, or how a mother's hand lingered protectively on her child's shoulder. Whenever rumors of hardship stirred, for them, the war was not just history, it was present in the cautious way their families lived, in the careful saving of food, in the reverence for life's smallest comforts. And yet, beneath the heaviness, there was quiet strength. The same strength that had carried villagers into bunkers, that had kept schoolrooms alive with scraps of chalk, that had built stoves from salvaged bricks, now carried them into rebuilding. They planted, repaired, and created once more, even when it felt almost impossible. Slowly, the land healed. Fields grew green again. Rivers ran clear of smoke. In spring, wildflowers pushed up through the ruins of villages. A reminder that life would always return, however much the world tried to crush it. The memory of invasion left a mark not only on people, but on the rhythm of the nation itself. Holidays and gatherings took on new meaning, shaped by remembrance. A loaf of bread was never just bread, it was a reminder of hunger overcome. A warm stove was never just comforted, was proof of survival. Even silence had meaning, for in silence people honored those who had not come back. Over time, the war receded into the past, but its shadow never fully disappeared. It remained in memorials, in songs, in the faces of old veterans sitting quietly on benches, medals glinting faintly in the sun. It remained in the way families told stories of endurance, sometimes with tears, sometimes with pride, but always with a quiet reverence. For those who lived through it, the war was more than a memory, it was a part of their being, inseparable from who they had become. And in that way, it shaped the Soviet Union long after the last battle was fought. As night fell over the villages that had once known only fear, lamps glowed again in windows. Families gathered around tables, humble meals shared in peace. Children fell asleep to the sound of lullabies, not sirens. The quiet resilience of ordinary people, farmers, mothers, workers, children, had carried them through the darkest of years, and now that same resilience carried them forward. The war had left its shadow, but it had also left something else. The proof that, even in the harshest winter, spring will return. The memory of loss would never vanish, but alongside it lived the memory of endurance, of survival, of strength drawn from the simplest acts of living. And so, as the world settled into peace, the people rested, their hearts heavy, their bodies weary, but their spirit unbroken. In the silence of night, beneath skies once torn by fire, there was at last the possibility of sleep. A deep, dreamless sleep, where the weight of years might ease, and where, for a few hours, the war's shadow could lift.